In May of 1942, the carrier Lexington lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea. Her surviving dive bomber crews were shipped back to San Diego, exhausted but alive. Among them were men from Scouting 2 and Bombing 2, veterans who had just fought the first carrier battle in history. Now they were ordered to form the nucleus of a new unit, Carrier Replacement Air Group 10. Fresh pilots arrived, too, their gold naval aviator wings still bright, eager to prove themselves in the coming fight. The old Yorktown, heavily damaged, was rushed into dry dock at Pearl Harbor, and yard workers swarmed over her hull. Admiral Nimitz told her captain she had to be ready for combat in just 3 days. The Navy was gambling everything on a secret. Codebreakers had uncovered a Japanese plan to strike at a tiny atoll called Midway. On June 4th, the gamble paid off. Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway with their decks full of fueled and armed planes. In a single devastating attack, they sank 4 Japanese flat tops: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The war in the Pacific had turned, but the victory cost Scouting 5 dearly. Among the missing were veterans Lieutenant Sam Adams and Lieutenant Charlie Ware, along with several others who had been with the squadron since the beginning. Men like Johnny Loff and Gene Green were gone too. The squadron that limped back to Pearl Harbor was battered, its ranks thinned, its pilots and gunners exhausted but still determined. On June 24th, the squadron gathered on Ford Island for a change of command. Lieutenant Commander William Birch, hard-eyed and emotional, tried to speak to his men. His face screwed up and tears came to his eyes. He could not talk. His replacement was Lieutenant Turner Caldwell, a red-haired officer with combat experience stretching back to the earliest raids of the war. The men hoisted Caldwell onto their shoulders and carried him around. New pilots and gunners joined the squadron, filling the gaps left by the dead. One new pilot, Lieutenant Birney Strong, a quiet man with freckles and a Tom Sawyer face, climbed onto the wing of his Dauntless and said simply to his new gunner, "I hope I won't disappoint you." They had 6 weeks to train before the next campaign. The crucible of the Solomons was waiting. By the second week of July, Scouting 5 reported aboard the carrier Enterprise for intensive dive bombing and gunnery practice off Hawaii. The big flat top steamed in warm waters near Oahu, while her new air group sharpened its skills for the coming Solomons campaign. Ensign Hal Buell, a young pilot who had sat out the Coral Sea battle, checked his station on the plotted navigation board, a large laminated map with penciled approach lines reaching toward the distant Solomon Islands. He traced the route with his finger, wondering what awaited them. In the cockpit of an SBD, Chief Radioman Rocky Glidewell ran through radio checks with his pilot, Lieutenant Commander Turner Caldwell, the squadron's new commanding officer. Lieutenant Birney Strong paired with his gunner, Clay Strickland, and ran repeated dive-bombing runs against towed targets. Strickland, new to combat flying, found Strong a meticulous and confident pilot. "Strick, let's make every pass count," Strong said over the intercom. Ensign Jesse Barker, another fresh face, studied the SBD's release mechanism until he knew it cold. On the hangar deck, mechanics tuned engines and checked bomb racks. The squadron flew morning and evening patrols, banking over the blue Pacific as the sun climbed higher each day. Every man felt the pressure. The Marines would soon need them on Guadalcanal. On July 26th, Commander John Crommelin, the Enterprise air officer, gathered the air crews in the wardroom for a direct address. Crommelin paced before the seated pilots and gunners, his voice flat and hard. "Tomorrow the tide is going to turn," he said. "We are going to show no quarter. Our job is to take the fight to the enemy and keep it there." Ensign Hoot Gibson of Bombing 6, who had survived the Midway carrier battle, felt the words settle in his chest. Show no quarter meant they would hit hard and ask no favors. The room was silent as Crommelin finished. "The Japanese may have the initiative now, but we will take it away from them." After the talk, the squadrons broke into smaller groups for final briefings. Crommelin's bluntness had an effect. The rookies looked steadier, the veterans more resolved. Hal Buell, sitting in the back of the room, wrote a short note to his family about the speech, folding it into his flight jacket. Chief Glidewell spotted Buell's nervous gesture and offered a quiet nod. There would be no more practice runs. The next time they flew, it would be against real guns. The ship turned west toward the Solomons. By the evening of August 6th, with the invasion scheduled for dawn, the Enterprise was steaming northwest of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Robin Lindsay, the senior landing signal officer, held a final briefing in the VS-5 ready room. He held up two lighted wands and demonstrated the signals for a night landing cut, wave off, low pass. "You may be coming back after dark," he said. "Watch the paddles, not the deck." The pilots listened in silence. Ensign Jesse Barker remembered thinking, "We had no night training beyond this. Just those wands and a promise we'd find the carrier." At dusk, the pilots filed out toward their SBDs. Caldwell and Glidewell walked to their plane together, the plotted navigation board still in Caldwell's hand, its pencil lines leading to the unseen coast of Guadalcanal. "Tomorrow we hit them," Caldwell said quietly. Glidewell nodded and climbed into the rear cockpit. Across the flight deck, Birney Strong tested his microphone while Strickland checked the .30 caliber machine guns. All across the carrier, men settled into their cockpits, waiting for the first light. The invasion of the Solomons was about to begin. The trumpet call for flight quarters sounded at 4 in the morning on August 7th. Weary aviators pulled on their flight gear, gulped coffee, and hurried to their ready rooms for last-minute briefings. The three American carriers turned into the wind in the darkness, and the first planes roared down the flight decks at 5:35. Turner Caldwell throttled up to the starting line, checked his instruments, and released his brakes. His SBD lifted off into the black sky with Rocky Glidewell in the rear seat, followed by 8 more dive bombers from Scouting 5. The sky over Tulagi was a vortex of red, white, and green lights, from hundreds of planes converging from 3 different carriers. Hal Buell, flying wing on Caldwell, watched battleships and cruisers unload their big guns with flashes of fire toward Japanese positions ashore. He followed his skipper into a dive on Tulagi's southeast coast at 6:15, and his 1,000-pound bomb landed squarely alongside Caldwell's on their target. For Buell, it was his first combat drop. There was surprisingly little opposition as the dauntless crews pulled out and joined the fighters in strafing enemy troop positions. Jesse Barker was flying his first combat mission that morning as well. His target was a radio station on Tanambogo Island, and he pushed over from altitude with the rest of his section. Barker released his bomb and pulled out low, glancing back to see a huge secondary explosion that sent flame and debris rocketing into the sky. He had hit his target. By mid-morning, the first wave of American planes had plastered gun positions, ammunition dumps, and Japanese camp areas, and the Marines were moving ashore onto the beaches of Guadalcanal and Tulagi. At 1:20 in the afternoon, a mixed flight of 8 Enterprise SBDs from Bombing 6 and Scouting 5 was orbiting over Tulagi at 8,500 feet. Lieutenant Carl Hornberger led the formation, awaiting instructions from the ground coordinator on which targets to bomb. The rear gunners sat easy in the cool air, their canopies closed against the cold. The rear gunners scanned the horizon idly. They had seen no Japanese planes all day. Suddenly, Carruthers pointed excitedly astern. A Zero was streaking toward them at high speed. It was Japan's top ace, Petty Officer, First Class Saburo Sakai, with 48 kills to his credit. Sakai saw what he thought were 8 American fighters and dove in to attack. He opened fire on the lead SBD, and a 20-millimeter shell struck the bomb vane of Ensign Hoot Gibson's plane. The shell ripped through the fuselage, shredded Gibson's radio, passed between the legs of his gunner, Ed Anderson, and exploded against Gibson's armored seat. The seat plating held, but the impact was like a kick in the pants. The American gunners responded immediately. Anderson, Jones, and Carruthers opened fire with their twin .30 caliber machine guns, pouring lead into the attacking Zero. Their bullets shattered Sakai's windscreen and tore into his head, blinding him in one eye. Sakai's Zero rolled inverted and spun away in flames, his wingman pressing the attack briefly before also taking hits. The rear gunners had disabled Japan's greatest ace, though the American bombers aborted their mission and limped back to Enterprise with several planes riddled by bullet holes. On the morning of August 8th, the dive bomber crews launched again for follow-up strikes on Japanese positions. Turner Caldwell led his Scouting 5 crews in attacking targets on Tanambogo and Macombo Islands. The Marines had occupied Gavutu, and equipment was coming ashore on Tulagi's west coast. By early afternoon, the strikes had been successful, and the landing forces were establishing their beachhead. The aviators grabbed sandwiches and coffee between sorties as their SBDs were refueled and rearmed. Admiral Fletcher, commanding the carrier force, decided to withdraw his carriers from the Guadalcanal area earlier than planned. He had lost 20% of his fighters in 2 days of action, and the Japanese were fully alerted to his presence. The transports and screening warships were left exposed, still offloading supplies on the beaches. Fletcher's decision drew heavy scorn from the Marines ashore, who now faced the Japanese without air cover. That night, Japanese warships slid through the darkness toward the Allied fleet off Savo Island. In the worst naval defeat in American history, 1 Australian and 3 American heavy cruisers were blasted to shreds and sank to the depths of Iron Bottom Sound. The American transport ships were forced to weigh anchor and haul clear of the area. The ground forces on Hell's Island were on their own, and the long, bloody struggle for Guadalcanal had only just begun. In the 2 weeks after the Savo Island disaster, the Enterprise Task Force settled into a grinding routine of search patterns and anti-submarine patrols. Each morning, scouting 5 pilots climbed into their SBDs and flew monotonous legs across empty ocean, scanning for periscopes or wakes. On August 23rd, Lieutenant Commander Caldwell spotted a submarine while leading a patrol and dropped a 500-pound bomb near its starboard bow. The I-boat crashed, dived, and vanished before any damage could be confirmed, leaving the crews frustrated by the endless, uneventful seas. The lull was broken by brief, violent contacts. That same day, Lieutenant Birney Strong and his wingman caught the submarine I-17 on the surface, 80 miles northeast of Caldwell's position, landing a bomb close enough to force it back to the surface. Their strafing runs chewed up the conning tower before the boat submerged again, trailing oil. But these scattered encounters were the exception. Most flights returned with nothing to report but empty ocean and the growing weight of tropical fatigue. On August 24th, the carrier forces finally converged. Strong's 2-plane search team was the first to sight a Japanese flattop, the light carrier Ryujo, steaming north of Guadalcanal. He circled on the horizon, counted the ship types, and tapped out a contact report to Enterprise. Then he turned for home without diving to attack. That decision would draw sharp criticism from Air Officer Crommelin, who expected his pilots to press home every opportunity. Later that afternoon, Japanese dive bombers from Shokaku and Zuikaku struck Enterprise, planting 3 bombs that set her flight deck ablaze. With the carrier unable to recover aircraft, Lieutenant Commander Caldwell led 11 SBDs of Flight 300, including Ensign Hal Buell, toward Guadalcanal, landing at Henderson Field by the light of Jeep headlights. They had become members of the Cactus Air Force, stranded on an island fought over hourly by 2 determined enemies. At dawn on August 25th, Turner Caldwell's Flight 300 crews woke to the rumble of distant artillery. They had spent their first night on Guadalcanal sleeping in the dirt, their SBDs parked under palm trees near Henderson Field. The primitive conditions of the Cactus Air Force struck them immediately. Hand-pumped fuel from 50-gallon drums, captured Japanese rice for breakfast, and the constant threat of snipers in the surrounding jungle. That morning, the Coast Watchers reported a Japanese reinforcement convoy steaming south. Lieutenant Colonel Dick Mangrum of the Marine Squadron VMSB 232 led a mixed strike group of 16 SBDs, including several of Caldwell's Navy crews. Among them was Ensign Chris Fink, a young Bombing 6 pilot from Wyoming who had never dropped a bomb in anger until the previous day. Fink climbed to altitude and pushed over on a large transport ship, the Kinryu Maru. His 1,000-pound bomb struck amidships just aft of the bridge. A sheet of flame and smoke rose to the clouds as the ship began to burn. From the rear seat, gunner Milo Kimberlin watched the explosion and called out. The stack and bridge lifted right out of the ship. The transport was later scuttled, and a Japanese destroyer was sunk by B-17s while attempting to rescue survivors. 5 nights later, the grinding routine of the Cactus Air Force took a different turn. Ensign Spike Conzet, a tall, lean Iowan, was summoned for a night mission. Japanese destroyers were moving down the slot, likely carrying troops to reinforce the island. Conzette and his gunner, Jim Kales, climbed into their SBD and took off into the moonless darkness at midnight. Through a break in the clouds, Kales spotted 5 ships close to the beach, dead in the water and unloading. Conzette pushed into his dive, but the destroyers opened fire with everything they had. A shell ripped through the cockpit, shattering the instrument panel and lodging shrapnel deep into Conzette's leg. He lost consciousness as the SBD began a spiraling plunge toward the ocean. From the rear seat, Jim Kales grabbed the controls and wrestled the Dauntless back under control. He flew the plane from the back cockpit, navigating by instinct through 800 feet of broken clouds. When Conzette briefly regained coherence, Kales kept his hands on the stick to prevent him from flying back into the flak. He brought the damaged SBD down on Henderson Field, guided by Jeep headlights. Kales hoisted the wounded pilot onto his back, carried him through the mud to the hospital tent, and then collapsed beside his plane. By late September, the 5 weeks on Guadalcanal had taken a brutal toll. Dysentery and malaria thinned the ranks of Flight 300. Ensign Walt Coolbaugh lost over 50 pounds and looked like a walking skeleton. Roger Woodhull, the executive officer, was shipped out with severe sickness. The crews had lost nearly all their SBDs to bombing, shelling, or mechanical failure. The last flyable aircraft was blown to pieces during a noon air raid on September 27th. The following afternoon, the surviving Flight 300 crews boarded a DC-3 transport plane for the flight to Espiritu Santo. Turner Caldwell, still sporting the bushy red beard he had grown in the jungle, climbed into the cargo hold with his men. Jim Kales noted in his diary that it was the brightest moment of his entire Cactus ordeal. Colonel Mangrum shook hands with the Navy gunners and told them, "You're the best damn bunch of Marines I ever saw in bell-bottom trousers." At Espiritu Santo, Caldwell and his crew transferred to a PBY patrol bomber that carried them to Pearl Harbor. He reported to Admiral William Halsey on Ford Island, still wearing the beard. Halsey took one look at the gaunt, sunburned commander and growled, "Get rid of that beard and come back to see me." Caldwell shaved it off at his parents' home in Kailua and returned. Halsey recommended him for a Gold Star in lieu of a Third Navy Cross, then ordered him to Jacksonville, Florida to train new pilots. Meanwhile, the carrier Enterprise had completed her repairs and returned to Pearl Harbor. She took aboard a new Air Group 10, which included several veteran pilots from the Coral Sea and Eastern Solomons battles. Scouting 10 carried 5 combat-tested pilots from Scouting 5, including Lieutenant Birney Strong. Strong had not forgotten the criticism he received for failing to attack the carrier Ryujo in August. He told his friend Hal Buell one evening that he intended to prove his courage the next time he found a Japanese flat top. The night before Enterprise sailed for the Santa Cruz operation, Lieutenant Jack Lepla, the material officer for Fighting 10, drove to a marine supply compound on Oahu. He pulled his pistol on the sentry and appropriated several aircraft starters for his squadron's Wildcats. When his pilot expressed concern, Lepla replied, "The skipper doesn't need to know about this. If they want me, they'll have to come after us in the Solomons." On the afternoon of October 25th, Admiral Kinkaid ordered a desperate long-range strike against the Japanese carrier force. The mission was plagued by garbled communications and extreme distances. The strike group flew to the limits of its fuel range, found nothing, and turned back in darkness. Lieutenant Swede Vetasa, a fighter pilot, slammed down his chartboard, called the admiral a stupid ass, and went directly to the flag bridge to voice his protest. He was not court-martialed. Several SBDs and TBFs ran out of fuel and ditched into the sea. Most crews were rescued, but the mission was a costly failure. Before dawn on October 26th, the Enterprise launched 16 SBDs for a wide-area search over the Santa Cruz Islands. Ensign Martin Carmody and his gunner, aviation radioman 3rd Class John Liska, flew one of the northern sectors. Liska, a veteran of the Coral Sea battle who had shot down 3 Zeros while serving as a rear gunner in Scouting 2's Dauntlesses, kept a sharp eye on the horizon. When 3 Zeros from the carrier Zuiho attacked, Liska called directions to Carmody and opened fire with his twin 30 caliber machine guns. One of the fighters rolled into a dive trailing smoke and crashed into the sea. A few sectors to the west, Lieutenant Birney Strong and his wingman, Ensign Chuck Irvine, picked up a contact report from their squadron commander. Strong adjusted his course and climbed through the scattered clouds. At 7:40 in the morning, he spotted two large Japanese carriers on the horizon, still launching aircraft. Strong tapped the top of his helmet to signal Irvine, pushed the nose of his SBD over and dove from 14,000 feet. The sun was directly behind him. He aimed for the red circle painted on the flight deck of the smaller carrier, Zuiho. At 1,500 feet, Strong yanked the bomb release and felt his 500-pound bomb drop free. Irvine followed a quarter-mile behind. Both bombs slammed into Zuiho's stern, tearing a 15-meter hole through the after-flight deck and rendering it useless for flight operations. As Strong pulled out low over the water, 12 Zeros swarmed toward him. He and Irvine weaved and dodged for 50 miles before losing their pursuers in a rain squall. Strong had found his redemption. After the battle, the surviving air crews returned to Pearl Harbor and scattered to new assignments. Turner Caldwell trained new pilots in Florida and received a Gold Star in lieu of a Third Navy Cross. Hal Buell recovered from his wounds and transferred to Bombing 10, where he flew again in the Solomons. Hoot Gibson survived the war and carried the memory of his friend Steve Zarnecki with him for decades. Birney Strong continued flying with Scouting 10, his courage no longer in question. Spike Conzette, evacuated from Guadalcanal on September 1st, spent months recovering from his shrapnel wounds before returning to limited duty. Rocky Glidewell finished his tour after recovering from his bullet wound and rotated back to a non-combat assignment. Jesse Barker and Chris Fink both survived the war, their time in the Cactus Air Force a harrowing memory of their youth. Jim Kales was evacuated from the island in late September and assigned to a training command, his combat flying finished. Clay Strickland continued flying with Birney Strong in Scouting 10 and survived the war. The dive bomber crews who held the line at Guadalcanal and struck back at Santa Cruz proved that the Navy's dauntless squadrons could absorb the worst the enemy could deliver and still come back fighting. The final image of that campaign was not a burning carrier or a smoking airfield, but a man named Birney Strong climbing out of his cockpit after a 50-mile chase. His guns still warm, his honor restored. If you have family stories, letters, or memories from fathers or grandfathers who served in the Pacific, we would be honored to hear them in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like to support our work. Thank you for listening and for keeping the memory of these men alive.